Around the world, grains such as corn and wheat are major staple crops. Having a reliable and affordable grain supply is a matter of food security. So when grain prices change, the effects are felt worldwide. There has been much talk about the relationship between ethanol production and grain prices, and as a result, food prices. Unfortunately, the message about this relationship is oftentimes oversimplified and misleading.
For a long time, there's been a lot of confusion around the relationship between food production, grain production, food security, and the use of ethanol as a fuel.
We don't have to make a choice. The world produces enough grain for a multitude of uses. In other words, this is not about food versus fuel. This is about food and fuel. There are a number of factors that impact grain prices, ranging from farmer input costs, to weather, to yields, and demand for food, feed, and fuel products. However, the fact is that ethanol production accounts for less than 5% of the world's total grain production, just 175 million metric tons out of 3.6 billion. The vast majority of grain is used for animal feed and food. So what is all this talk about food and fuel? The food or fuel debate heated up when grain prices doubled from 2008 to 2011. Because this coincided with significant growth in grain demand for ethanol beginning in 2002, the blame for price increases in food was laid on the ethanol industry. But many other factors were at play during this period that drove up grain prices. For one, rising global demand for food and animal feed during this period was a large contributor and far outweighed the increase in grain demand for ethanol, and continues to do so today. But the greatest impact on food prices during this period was the spiking increase in the price of crude oil, which rose from $70 per barrel in 2007 to $145 per barrel in 2008.
Back in 2008, price of rice went sky high. Nobody uses rice as a feedstock for ethanol. All of these commodities had almost the same chart action. But what was being blamed for everything was corn ethanol in the United States. But that was silly 10 years ago. It's still silly today.
The implied connection between ethanol production and food prices is a myth. Today, ethanol production is at an all-time record high. At the same time, food prices are at their lowest in a decade, further coinciding with decreased oil prices. Ethanol production plants continue to improve their efficiency and get more gallons of fuel out of the same volume of feedstock with less energy. Farmers continue to grow even more grain year after year to meet increased demand for meat and dairy products for the burgeoning middle class. As a result, the percentage of grain devoted to ethanol is expected to decrease even further. Concerns over changes of agricultural land use have been incorrectly attributed to increased ethanol production. In reality, even before ethanol production began in earnest, the number of acres harvested for grain was on a downward trend, thanks in great part to increased yields per acre. In other words, the world was already growing enough grain to meet growing demand and continues to do so. Today, the total harvested land area remains below its previous peak in 1980, while ethanol production is at an all-time high. So ethanol production has not led to increased pressure on available land. Even with the increased grain demand for biofuels, stockpiles of grain are at some of the highest levels in history. Conventional corn ethanol is produced from the starch within a kernel of field corn. The protein and fiber remain. These components essentially pass through the ethanol plant and become a high-quality animal feed called distiller's grains. In fact, nearly 40% of the nutritional value of corn used in ethanol production is retained and returned to the feed sector in the form of distiller's grains and corn oil. That feed is fed to animals to produce meat, eggs, and dairy products for a rapidly growing middle class around the globe.
If we look at the world today, the world is producing more grain than it ever has. The stocks of grain are as high or higher than they have ever been. And the world is simultaneously producing more ethanol than it has ever produced before from grain.
So we really don't have to make a choice between food and fuel, because when ethanol is produced from corn, we are producing fuel and food.